Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. And hi, everyone. I'm Courtney Bobson. I work for the University of Washington's Olympic Natural Resources Center, and I will be talking about my work exploring a new approach to collaboration through the use of what we're calling learning groups. This work is being done through a large-scale experiment on the west side of the peninsula. And I'll get into these details in a minute, but I'll start first with just a little bit of background information. Next slide, please. So there has been an explosion of ideas and frameworks and processes around collaboration in the last 30 years. This includes national forest collaboratives that work on more region-specific issues, collaborative watershed partnerships, and programs like the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, or CFLRP. These collaborative groups follow different frameworks, typologies, organizational structures, and different approaches. And oftentimes the most successful collaborative efforts are ones that can unite around a common issue, things like wildfire mitigation. And there have been successful programs and collaborative efforts that have really resulted in meaningful projects. However, there's not always an emphasis on formal learning and trying to learn together. Next slide, please. So we view learning as key to the collaborative process and to ensure that the work being done really pushes our understanding and our knowledge base forward. So we adopt the kind of broad umbrella of social learning for our application here. Social learning has been defined by many different researchers. I'll provide one definition here from Keene et al. From 2005, where they say that social learning is the collective action and reflection that occurs among different individuals and groups as they work to improve the management of human and environmental interrelations. Social learning has been applied to many different disciplines, including education, psychology, ecology, and many others. It's an iterative process that addresses uncertainty with an emphasis on learning. It can use collaboration and public participation to tackle issues, and it is context, location, and culture specific and should be tailored using these three factors. It's been applied to things like co-management, adaptive management, collaborative adaptive management, and many others within the natural resource world. We use a new application of social learning we refer to as learning groups in a large operational scale experiment on the west side of the peninsula. Next slide, please. So the Type 3 or T3 watershed experiment is a 20,000 acre watershed study within the Clearwater and Hoh watersheds on the west side of the peninsula. The study is a collaboration between the Washington Department of Natural Resources, or DNR, and the University of Washington through the Olympic Natural Resources Center. This study really brings together managers, researchers, stakeholders, and tribes to explore novel approaches to managing public lands with a goal of expanding the management toolbox. Public agencies like DNR already have tools that they use to sustainably manage their forest land, and this experiment is trying to learn how to expand the number of tools they have in their toolbox. And this is done by implementing both upland and riparian prescriptions at an operational scale over 4 different watersheds that you can see in this figure here, and testing these novel approaches compared to a standard practice. And a key and overarching aim of this study is to achieve ecosystem well-being. Next slide, please. So we've created a framework to achieve this ecosystem well-being. It has 2 key components, a community well-being and an environmental well-being component. Both are inherently interconnected and have interactions between them where learning can occur. And in this approach, we believe that both components should be considered simultaneously and with equal seriousness. And a key part of this framework, and that we've heard from other speakers in the last couple of days, is that people are part of our ecosystems. So to achieve ecosystem well-being really means to meet the needs of local communities. And that starts with a process to engage people. Next, please. So we've developed an approach called learning-based collaboration to do this. And in this process, managers, researchers, stakeholders, and tribes are engaging and collaborating with one another to address management questions and options. And this means that from the outset, stakeholders and tribes are part of this process, from study design to developing research questions to building monitoring plans. So we're co-developing the study together. Next, please. And then all of these input and ideas and feedback generated through this collaborative process can be then fed into something like the Type 3 watershed experiment. So the prescriptions are directly informed based, based on the needs and concerns of local people. Next, please. So over the course of the last several years, we've engaged with folks through interviews, workshops, conferences, field tours, and countless informal meetings. And through this process, we've developed several different prescriptions that were directly connected to community concerns. For example, Western red cedar, its health and regeneration was a really key concern for many people, especially within the environmental and tribal communities. So cedar was the basis for the cedar and alder polyculture prescription that you see in this alternative 2 strategy above, highlighted in a black box. So all of the prescriptions in that box were directly derived from feedback from stakeholders and tribes through this collaborative process. And after the study plan was completed, there was an interest to continue engaging on this project, but in a more focused and topic-specific role, rather than the entire study plan, but focusing on specific parts of it. And this led to the development and the formation of these learning groups. Next, please. So stakeholders and tribes were interested in continuing their participation around these focused topics that they had either a personal or professional interest in. So learning groups emerged through this process as a way to continue collaboration, to work towards our study goals, and really to learn together. Each of these learning groups is made up of 3 key groups. The first being T3 researchers, second, forest managers and practitioners, and third, stakeholders and tribes. The T3 researchers have expertise in things like study design, statistics, research question development. Forest managers and practitioners have expertise on past effects of management, treatment feasibility, harvesting operations, silviculture. And the stakeholders and tribes have their own expertise, their own values, needs, and knowledge about how public lands management impacts their both individual and their community's well-being. So including all 3 groups together, we believe can really enrich these scientific ideas. It can build trust amongst us, increase buy-in, and ensure that the research that's being done can connect back to management in a tangible way. And although there are many examples of management being informed by stakeholders and/or by tribes, there are few examples of large-scale research that includes all of these 3 groups working together to co-develop a study like this. Next, please. So topics for these learning groups really naturally emerged by working with the stakeholders and tribes who were interested in specific topics that couldn't be incorporated directly into the T3 watershed experiment. For example, invasive species was a key concern, but we didn't have really researcher capacity to include this as part of the study. However, there was interest in studying how invasive species were entering these recently harvested units and how to mitigate the growth of and spread of species like Scotch broom. So this became one of the first of the learning groups to form. So there are 8 learning groups total that have been operating for about 1.5 years now. The groups range from carbon sequestration to aquatic responses to history, and you can see the full list here. And each group had different goals and level of engagement and different people who participate in them. Next, please. We found that the 8 different groups really naturally fell into these 3 different broad categories based on their level of engagement and the projects that they work on. So these groups are updates and review, information exchange, and research and monitoring. Next, please. Several of the learning groups fell into this updates and review category where they have limited capacity to work on new or additional projects. They are primarily reviewing relevant documents and study plans, they're providing feedback, and are taking the information back to their own organizations. The key participants include those that are affected by the outcomes of the T3 experiment. Many of these participants are very interested in the work and the outcomes of the study, but don't have capacity to meet frequently and engage very much. Next, please. A second category is information exchange. These are learning groups whose members typically work in a field similar to the topic and are often subject matter experts. They share information between the T3 team and their own organization. These groups often co-develop projects, and they participate in things like data sharing, creating monitoring plans. They might work on analyses together. These groups are not necessarily creating new sub-study plans, but are interested in the work that's being done within the T3 watersheds. And occasionally a group that starts an information exchange might become more involved and move into research and monitoring. Next, please. And the final category is research and monitoring. So these are the most engaged learning groups. They're working towards the creation of sub-studies within the T3 experiment areas. They're providing input, conducting literature reviews, they're reviewing study plans, writing separate grants for future work, and much more. So these groups are made up of external researchers, subject matter experts, and our most highly engaged stakeholders. Not all groups will look the same or have similar goals, but all of them are connected to the T3 watershed experiment in some way and are advancing that work. Next, please. So throughout this process, we have reflected on what has led to some of the success that we've seen in the learning groups and have a few just key insights to share. We think that these elements are kind of helpful if you're thinking about implementing something like a learning group elsewhere. First, a connection to an existing operational scale watershed experiment was really key. Having the learning groups connected to DNR forest management operations allowed them to have additional resources and support by the Type 3 watershed project leads. They have space within or adjacent to the study areas to work on their sub-studies and a variety of different scientific questions and management uncertainties for the groups to work on. Second, hiring a facilitator was an important element. Having a dedicated and trained facilitator to work with all of these groups was really key. She provides cohesion between each of the groups, can be seen as more of a neutral party, and can foster this kind of cross collaboration between all of the groups. She sets up meetings and agendas, she takes notes, follows up with the learning groups afterwards. And this really takes the burden off of the other members, most of whom are volunteering their time. We also see the learning groups building off of some of the existing trust and rapport built during the T3 experiment study development. So we spent several years working with community members, tribes, and other stakeholders to ensure that their perspectives were heard and incorporated. And we think that this built relationships and rapport, laid the foundation for some of this learning group initial success. In addition, having key stakeholders was really important. So for some of the more technical groups, it was critical to have subject matter experts or other scientists who could provide their perspective and lend some of their expertise. And this was important to push the groups forward. And lastly, having an enthusiastic leader driving the group has been really great and key. In our CEDAR learning group, we have a master's student whose project was to co-develop a study with this learning group. And she was passionate and excited. She had time in her schedule to work on this project, and the other members were eager to assist her. So having her push the group forward meant that they made really rapid progress and ended up creating a full sub-study plan to evaluate ungulate browsing on cedar seedlings. So those are just a few reflections of why we think we've seen some initial success, but as always, there's constraints to this work. So next slide, please. So I'll finish with just a few constraints to consider if implementing this type of thing elsewhere. Many collaborative efforts with members who tend to be on opposing sides often focus on their zone of agreement. So projects are getting pushed forward. The ones that are getting pushed forward are ones that members can all agree upon or kind of at least tolerate. And this certainly works well to build trust, but it can fail to facilitate some of this learning about areas of disagreement, in part because a lot of those collaborative groups are trying to make management decisions. And on our side, we're really focused on people-oriented research and development. So in our case, we suggest for the learning groups a zone of learning approach. So this means creating an environment where ideas and innovations are tolerated enough to try to compare one another through experimentation and using the scientific process. Having existing rapport is important for implementing these learning groups. This was built through the creation of the T3 experiment and the learning group process. And really that continued to build this rapport. So if doing this work in a different setting, starting with this will be important. And lastly, we believe that including these three groups is critical. These researchers, managers, stakeholders, and tribes. Each bring their own knowledge and expertise and influences on one another, without which we think that this large-scale study really wouldn't have been possible. These groups must have an interest and a willingness to work together, and a commitment to learning together. And finding people from these three groups that have the capacity and the professional flexibility to this, to attempt this, certainly might be a constraint. But overall, we think that this has been a really fulfilling process that we will continue to learn from going forward. And we're happy to report more results when we get further along in this process. And one more slide, please. I would just like to say thank you to everyone listening today. Thanks so much to our partners at Washington DNR, especially Teddy Minkova and Tracy Petrovsky, who have been instrumental in creating these learning groups, and for everyone who's participated in the learning group so far. I'd just like to say thanks to all of them. If you're interested in joining any of the learning groups you saw, please feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm happy to talk more. And yeah, thanks to everybody, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Oops, sorry. I was just talking with my mic muted still after all this time. Thank you for a great presentation. And I was so caught up in listening, I forgot to give you the 2-minute warning. So thanks for wrapping it up on time. This seems like a really powerful and useful framework to approach collaborative co-management and project development, as we're trying more and more to do in our parks. I'm sorry if you said this at the beginning, but I'm really curious how this obviously takes a significant amount of capacity with a facilitator and everything. How was it funded? And did it kind of come from the university, or did it come from DNR? Kind of curious about that, and how you went about assembling the whole group to begin with.
Yeah, so our facilitator is Tracy Petrovsky, who is wonderful. She works for DNR, and she works 30% of her time facilitating the learning groups and working on the T3 experiment. And the other part of her time is funded elsewhere within her other job at DNR. But largely the experiment is funded through a mixture of funding through the legislature, funding through DNR, and kind of other external grants and researchers who bring in some funding. And so it's kind of a mix of things. And sorry, can you repeat your second question?
Just kind of how you got the teams together. Was it a sort of wide invitation, and then whoever said yes ended up being part of it, or was it selected by people on the ground who had worked together before? Or
yeah, it was kind of a mix. So initially we had some particularly engaged folks who really wanted some things added to the study that we just couldn't, we didn't have funding or capacity to add more elements to a complex study. And those became some initial of the learning groups. We also have an annual Olympic Experimental State Forest Conference that we host in Forks. And in 2021, the conference was entirely about the learning groups. We had a mixture of stakeholders and researchers present different proposed learning group topics. So they presented, like, here's what the learning group might do, here's how it would connect back to the study, and then we had a long discussion with everyone in the conference of, is this of interest? What kind of things would you like to work on? Is there something to do here? And so I think there was maybe, I don't know, 150 people who joined that conference who got to participate. And then we have mailing lists that we provide input, updates to, and remind them to join the learning groups if they want to. So it's kind of a mixture of, like, people who were really engaged were immediately joining, but the invitation was wide, and it still is. If anyone's interested in participating, they're more than welcome to.
Great, yeah, thank you. That's helpful as we try to get similar things going down here. Getting the folks to participate can be challenging sometimes. I'll jump ahead to one. There's a long comment that I'll just let you read, but thank you for the comments very much. Question is, were tribal perspectives around conflict management utilized? Were those centered? And how did you engage in basic tribal research ethics of and observation reciprocity as researchers? Were gifts given to participants or other honorarium? Which tribes were included?
Okay, yeah, okay, so okay, let me back up a little bit. So the Olympic Natural Resources Center, ONRC, it's a University of Washington center, and we have a relationship with primarily with the coastal tribes. Kind of zooming out from the T3 experiment, we work with the coastal tribes in other kind of marine aspects, and as well as on the forestry side. We met with tribal councils from like 2016 to 2020, roughly, repeated meetings with tribal councils to try to make sure that this was something of interest to them. Once we got permission from some of the tribes to conduct interviews, we did some interviews. We went through a formal IRB process using human subjects to make sure we were doing this in an ethical way. We absolutely use a government-to-government process and are trying to go in the front door, and have been really mindful about how that relationship is built. Sorry, let me remind myself of the other questions. Were gifts given to the participants? I don't believe so, but I would need to think more and ask more people about that part of it. And which tribes were included? Primarily, the tribes that have been the most engaged are the Quileute tribe, the Ho tribe, and the Quinault Indian Nation, primarily because their ancestral and ceded lands are within the T3 experiment. Although more tribes are, of course, welcome. I mean, we could go in, we can go in long tangents about more of this, but maybe I'll just leave it there and can answer more questions in the chat later.
Thank you. That's great, Courtney. Appreciate it. Yeah, I'm sure we'll have anyone wants to follow up in the chat, or I might be following up with you personally, Courtney.
Yeah. Maybe I'll also just add that the only learning group that's a little bit different is the tribal learning group. That does not have open membership. It's restricted to folks who either are tribal members or work for, say, a tribal Department of Natural Resources or some version of that. And if folks wanted to participate in that one, it would be up to the members of that group, because it's really focused on what the tribes need from the study, how we can provide data and more information and more monitoring for them. So that one works a little bit differently than the other ones, but all the other groups are kind of open, and yeah, we don't monitor or gatekeep participation.
Well, thank you very much.